You are now listening to Sanity at the Movies, Secret of Nimh edition. And the days of me coming up with creative things for my little addition gimmick have really died.
They might return.
You never know. You never know.
know.
Couldn't say. Hey, folks, who am I that has given up all creativity and joy in podcasting? It's Nathan, your humble and obedient host. We've got the preacher who's a teacher of cinema right there.
Hello.
Benjamin Sosa. A Frenchman. He is eating his baguette. He is smoking his cigarette with holding it from underneath. And I don't know what
Oui,
else.
oui, monsieur.
Oui, oui, monsieur. He's leaning on the Eiffel Tower. Leaning very far. Says he's leaning. Playing his accordion. And wearing a stripy shirt, if I didn't say that. Hey, he's not really French. Now he's miming. Now Ben's become a mime. It's a great moment in podcasting. How many podcasts have you ever tuned into? In fact, you want to hear Ben mime? Here we go. Now, the fun thing, folks, is that in order for the joke to work for you, the audience, Ben didn't have to do anything. And yet, just for me, he was trapped in a box. And then, I don't know what, did it fill up with water or something?
It was shrinking.
It was shrinking.
It was going to crush me. It'd be horrible.
Well, listen, speaking of things that are horrible, the later half of Don Bluth's career, or 2/3, he made some stinkeroos.
Boy.
Pebble and the Penguin, A Troll in Central Park,
I have the pleasure of not seeing these movies.
Thumbelina. We've talked about Don Bluth before, but we want to talk about Secret of Nimh because we're doing a thing we're calling Beyond the Wardrobe over on the Sound of Sanity podcast right now. And Ben, what's that all about?
It's all about children's fantasy literature, Nathan. Stuff that we recommend, that we like, that we wanted to go back and read and talk about.
And so we talked about the book Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh.
One of my favorites.
One of your favorites.
Yeah.
And maybe in like 30 seconds, you could tell us about that book and Robert O'Brien, the author.
Oh, yeah. Robert C. O'Brien. He wrote only 3 children's novels, and Secret of Nimh is the best of them. Easily. Actually, no, that's right. 3 children's novels. You could say 2. Anyway, whatever. Secret of Nimh is the best. And it's Secret of Nimh. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh. It's about a mouse named Mrs. Frisby who needs help from these strange rats to save the life of her son, Timothy, because their home is going to get plowed under and her son is sick and can't move. And anyway, it's a whole thing. And it's just a very sort of naturalistic, steady book about Mrs. Frisby making all of these sort of courageous decisions in a very ordinary way with a lot of really cool description of the woods and the danger of life in the woods and the field and the way that the different animals interact and relate. And it's just very gripping, very interesting. The story of the rats is weird, and the book has just cast kind of a spell on you. And I read it over and over as a kid, and I liked the sense of urgency and dread and melancholy that it brings. And I liked this movie too. Although this movie, while it does do some of the same things, is a different kettle of fish.
Yes, it only captures some of those qualities or some percentage of each of those qualities.
Yeah.
You just mentioned it has its own melancholy and its own danger and its own. It's much less interested than Robert C. O'Brien is in the actual natural world and the way that animals work. And I mean, he's not doing like White Fang or something like that.
No,
the animals are anthropomorphized a
They're
decent
talking
amount.
and thinking and
maybe even using satchels or wearing clothes to some degree. But he is just much more interested in what does an owl do? And in the sort of whole existential dilemma of nature red in tooth and claw.
That's
and
right.
all that sort of thing, which this movie has a flavor of, but
it does.
It doesn't. It wants to Disney it up. Not that it is a Disney movie, which we'll talk about it, but Don Bluth definitely sees himself in the lineage of Disney, so he wants to include things like explicit magic and a little bit more of a direct hero's journey and more comedy, more Disney-esque sort of comedy with.
That's right.
Good old Dom DeLuise playing good old Jeremy, the good old Crow or Raven or whatever
Crow,
he is.
yeah.
Crow.
Yep.
So, by the way, I forgot to hit any buttons, so I should hit I guess I'll hit the baggage button because you kind of give your baggage, and you could continue to give it. So
Oh,
It doesn't matter. It's in the past.
Yeah, but it still hurts.
Oh, yes, the past can hurt.
I never look back, darling. It distracts from the now.
that little sound effect indicates that we're supposed to give our baggage. What you already sort of said, but what baggage do you bring to this book or to this movie, Ben?
read the book it's based on many a time. Saw this movie, I think, many a time. I don't think I saw it as much as I read the book, but who knows? It's hard to say. I saw it a number of times. Was always a fan, and I think to some extent, I enjoyed it for different reasons than the book, because this movie ends with like a sword fight and magic and a really fun, violent climax, violent adventure style action adventure climax that the book most definitely does not have.
Yes.
Man, the book and the movie just scratched different itches. So I loved this movie for that reason. I mean, the animation is among, let me just see if I want to say this. The animation is awesome in this movie.
Agreed.
It's my favorite Don Bluth animation.
Yes,
and
I think I would agree with that.
It's great. It's some of the moodiest and atmospheric stuff I had ever seen in an animated movie at the time. I think until you hit anime, I don't know if there's anything quite like this, actually, because Disney just was Sleeping Beauty.
Sleeping Beauty, certain sections of certain Disney movies.
That's right.
In terms of sustaining a mood, this movie is much more interested in that. Than like for example, the original Disney movie, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, has that section where she's running through the woods and it's very fearsome and very scary. But then it all turns out to be cuddly creatures, and soon we're into bumbling dwarf comedy. And this movie has a little bit of bumbling comedy with Jeremy, but it's overall a little bit more sober, a little bit more serious, a little bit more melancholy.
Yeah, I think, the one thing that this movie shares with the book is, boy, you live in a menacing world, Field Mouse, and there's a lot of menacing and bad things that could happen, and a lot of creatures that you should be afraid of in your life. You might find your life hanging by a thread at any moment.
Yes.
And I just liked that as a kid. I liked the intensity of that stuff. It's probably one of the reasons I also resonated with Return to Oz, which we talked about in an earlier podcast. And it's sort of darkness, although the Return to Oz is also a different kind of thing.
Right.
But they're both, I liked the darker Kids Fair. So that's my history with this movie.
Well, I don't want to say anything about like Thumbelina or anything like that, because those movies all really just stink. But in his three, shall we say, masterpieces, in his three minor masterpieces, Secret of Nimh, American Tail, and Land Before Time, Bluth, he has a way with menace and with a very frantic sense of danger.
Yes.
Like when the cat attacks Mrs. Brisby, as she is in the movie.
In this movie.
It's very similar actually to the cat attack in American Tail, and very similar to Sharptooth in the Land Before Time, in that it is just ferocious and you are doing everything you can to scramble away from the danger as quickly as possible while it is within one hair of chomping you into two pieces. And he's likes to include sequences like that. And this movie has a number of them actually, where it's just like, wow, this is some pretty hardcore stuff for a kid's movie. And the sword fight, probably the best sword fight. I can't say through animation, because obviously anime and lots of things like that have great sword fights. But in terms of a classic American studio children's film anime, like Disney's animated classics line never had a sword fight that came anywhere close to this.
Sleeping Beauty would be the closest, right?
Sleeping Beauty, the fight with the dragon's great, but I wouldn't say it's as good just in terms of a sword fight as this is. And then the only other thing that even comes close is The Beast versus Gaston, Dawn of Justice. That's more about stalking each other through a Gothic castle sort of thing in the rain than it is about actual combat. So, yeah, good stuff. Well, my baggage is that I like this movie. I've seen it. I mean, I didn't really grow up with it. I grew up with American Tail, and I grew up with Land Before Time, and for whatever reason, I've seen a lot of the other dumb Don Bluth movies like Pebble and the Penguin, which are just tripe. Just absolute tripe. And
All Dogs Go to Heaven.
All Dogs Go to Heaven.
Hot garbage.
Kind of bothered
So
me as a kid.
awful.
Like, it's actually doing like a story that's all set around the afterlife and heaven and hell, and kind of taking its mythology of those things kind of seriously.
Yeah, it's gross.
Yeah, it's just weird. Bugs Bunny would go to hell every once in a while. Like you saw that kind of thing. And that in and of itself could be its own kind of bothersome as a kid and even as maybe in a different way as an adult. But you knew you weren't supposed to take it all that seriously. But Don Bluth is just the master of ill-conceived ideas. Like
he is, yeah.
I want to say he's actually just not that great. Like I think he got lucky a couple times and Nimh is one of those times. I think he had one Nimh in him, which even there, I'm not sure his instincts are actually that great.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
And then he did two with Spielberg, where Spielberg had some good instincts, and maybe the collaboration was good, and Bluth brought things to it. But then you just have Pebble and the Penguin, and Thumbelina. It's just like these things where it's just like, who thought a kid would like this? Like kids don't like this. This is boring and stupid and concerned with things that kids aren't concerned with. Well, let me give some context on Mr. Bluth before we dive into The Secret of Nimh.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
You may think you know what you're dealing with, but believe me, you don't.
So I gave some of this context back in our American Tail episode, but I'm just going to take us through a chunk of it again, the chunk that gets us to Nimh. So the way to understand Bluth is that, as I think I said in that episode, is he's the Tesla to Disney Company's Edison, and that he's the direction that things could have gone. He represented a path not taken. He represented someone who the Disney Corporation tried to hire right before they had their renaissance, and maybe thankfully they didn't, and then they had their renaissance with Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast in the late 80s and early 90s. But he was one of those guys, which I guess our Batman episode won't have come out when this comes out, but in our Batman episode we talk about Tim Burton as being another one of these guys who grew up with classic Disney animation and then actually joined Disney, and Disney didn't have a good, like the nine old men, the guys that were responsible for a lot of Disney's great animation and a lot of Disney's success were getting older and dying, and Disney did not have a clear vision for the future or for mentorship or for passing the baton. And so you had a lot of young, hungry guys who liked the early classics of animation and wanted to keep doing stuff that spoke to them, that was dark, that was primal, that had some real teeth to it, some real storytelling juice to it, and Disney was busy making mistakes, making Aristocats and Oliver and Company and stuff that has its charms, but just was not at all what why you don't go into animation because you're excited to make Oliver and Company. You go into it because you're excited to make Snow White or Dumbo or something like something that tells a real story. So anyway, Don Bluth was born in 1937. Came out the same year that Snow White did, and he began to draw every day. Don Bluth is all he really has left at this point is his legacy. He's still with us, and he's probably not going to make another movie, and so he kind of has to dine out on the 3 or 4 movies that people actually like. He made a lot of bad movies and movies that aren't well loved or well remembered, but he also made
Anastasia is
people. I don't know that it has like a huge fan base, but people liked it fine when it came out, and there's people that remember it fondly. It's not like a beloved classic. It's B tier, I'd say, not A tier. But in any case, Don Bluth really likes to this day, sort of sell himself as this magical sort of elfin figure that was just gifted with art and with animation and stuff. So he said he saw Snow White. I don't know how he saw Snow White when he was 0 years old, but he must have seen it in a release, or he just likes to tell the story. So in any case, he was inspired by Snow White to draw every day. If he goes 24 hours without drawing something, to this day, Ben, he feels all crazy and cramped up inside, and he's just got to draw. He grew up in El Paso, Texas, and then later in Payson, Utah. The Utah part of that is important because his great-grandfather was Helaman Pratt, an early leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and one of the founders of Prattville, Utah, which is a hub for them. If people know Mitt Romney, the one-time Republican presidential candidate, they are second cousins, and Romney is, of course, Mormon. Bluth went to Brigham Young University in Utah for a year, continued to pursue his art, and then in 1955, he was hired by Walt Disney as an assistant for Sleeping Beauty, which was released in 1959. So Bluth got to work on Sleeping Beauty for a couple of years, but he was just an assistant and he found it kind of boring. And I don't know, it's interesting because it actually is a great movie and a great classic and the thing that kind of comes the closest to what Bluth wanted. But for whatever reason, he wasn't satisfied working on it back in those days. And so he left Disney in 1957. And he does take his religion seriously. He is a committed Mormon, and he was back then too. And so he actually spent 2.5 years in Argentina after he left Disney on a mission for the church. And he asked God, apparently, like, if I go on this mission, can I be sure when I come back I can pick up where I left off? But God did not answer him. So he did not know whether he would be able to pick up his art, but he knew he had to go to Argentina and be a missionary. So, of course, people didn't speak a lot of Spanish in Argentina. And so the way he helped connect people was he would draw pictures. I'm using a somewhat mocking tone, not because I necessarily disbelieve any of these stories, but just because he likes his own legend, and he everything he tells, all the stories he tells him about himself are kind of this way, as if he had this magical gift. And in any case, he did some mission work and then got back into art, did some commercial art, returned to Disney in 1971, which Disney in 1971 is kind of I never know how to say this word, nadir, Nadir, Nadir. How do you pronounce that word? It's one of those words I read all the time, but I don't know how to pronounce it. Nadir, I guess.
I never know how to pronounce it either. Let's see.
Yeah, okay.
I bet dictionary can help.
I bet it will. We're taking time out for this.
Nadir.
Nadir.
Or nadir.
Nadir. Okay. I prefer nadir, so I'm going to go with nadir. So he returns to Disney in 1971, and that is kind of the nadir of Disney, thereabouts. This is like a few years after Walt died, and so they really haven't got their act together, and they're releasing things that have their fans, and maybe some of their fans are in this room. I'm certainly married to some of their fans, but like Robin Hood, everybody loves Robin Hood. I think it's pretty cheap and lame. The one with the foxes and stuff. Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, Pete's Dragon, just kind of lame, poorly animated. Like The Rescuers has this title sequence where they don't animate anything. It's just still shots, like drawings, paintings, whatever. And it just feels cheap. And so Bluth, like many young men, like Tim Burton, like others, like John Lasseter, grew up idolizing Disney, thinking that Walt Disney himself and Walt Disney, the company, was just the greatest of storytellers, and moral and strong and dark and interesting and fun. And it just seemed like they were just trying to make money. When these guys actually got into the system, they did not like what they found, and nor should they have, because Disney was just trying to make money, and they didn't have a strong artistic vision at that time. It was a dark period. There was a lot of cost cutting. They had lost their way in terms of making stories that actually connected to these classical archetypical themes that Walt Disney actually had back in the day. Like I said, the 9 old men were starting to retire. There was no sort of mentorship program. And so Bluth and his future business partner, Gary Goldman, who is kind of the dude in the background that's worked on all of these things from Nimh to Anastasia to Titan AE. I think Titan AE was the thing that finally just drove Bluth out of the business. They finally stopped putting chips on this guy's
hand.
Yeah. So anyway, he and like 17 Disney employees get together in Bluth's garage and start working on something called Banjo the Woodpile Cat. And they're trying to figure out what makes a Disney cartoon a Disney cartoon. What are the secrets of how to do that kind of great animation? And Bluth ends up leading kind of a mini, not revolt or coup, but what's it called when you all exit at the same time? Like there's a word for this.
An exodus.
Yeah, an exodus. Yeah, he leads a little exodus and gets a bunch of former Disney animators who are all frustrated with Disney. And they found Don Bluth Studios. And they actually, hilariously enough, because it's such a lame movie, they delay Fox and the Hound by leaving. They're just like, bye guys. And then Disney's like, wait, we can't make Fox and the Hound anymore. And they're like, okay, who cares? And I think Tim Burton was also a failed animator on Fox and the Hound.
That's right.
Like everybody hated Fox and having to work on Fox and the Hound. And I don't know that I blame them. So Bluth gets together like 160 animators and does this profit sharing contract, this very sort of noble idea where they're all going to share in the profit of Secret of Nimh. And they make Secret of Nimh, and they do it in direct sort of opposition to what Disney has become. And basically the company would have folded after that because Nimh was not a huge success. Nimh came out in 1982. It opened the opening weekend of a movie. You may remember us talking about all this stuff on our American Tail episode, but if our listeners don't remember, it opened against a little movie about an alien that rides Spike across the moon. And
Mac and Me.
Yeah. About a boy that's stuck in a wheelchair that goes humorously off a cliff. No. This opened against E.T., and of course, E.T. mopped the floor with it. MGM also lost confidence in it and really didn't give it a marketing campaign. And it was just mishandled. I think it actually would have been a moderate success if, like it did well in the theaters where it was actually pushed, but it just wasn't. It basically didn't get a large release. And so this movie did okay. It was a moderate success, but became more of a Bluth's company wasn't going to survive. And really what it did was gave him the calling card that got him a meeting with Spielberg, which got American Tail and helped him survive in the industry. But if Spielberg wasn't interested in him, then this movie just would have been the end of Don Bluth's career because it didn't do that well. It became more of a, you got to remember, home video is only just hitting in the 80s. And so this became this is one of the first movies that kind of became a minor hit on home video. And in terms of the making of the movie itself, there's not a lot to say. Bluth obviously saw himself in the classic Disney lineage, wanted to make something that was more scary and more all the things we've been talking about, more archetypal. Chose kind of an interesting book to do that because I don't know that the book actually necessarily jives with all those concerns.
No, I don't think so.
Bluth's doing comedy in the Disney style with Jeremy, which doesn't really jive with the book. He's also adding magic, a very potent magical element to the story. Famously, I forget whether they reached out. I don't know. Yeah, this is what it was. They reached out to Whammo, who manufacture Frisbees, and said, hey, we're going to make a movie called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nimh. And they were like, don't do that. We will sue you. We're not going to waive our rights to Frisbees. And so they changed the lead character's name to Brisby and changed the name of the movie to The Secret of Nimh, which is arguably a cooler name, I would say, than Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nimh. But apparently they had to edit. Like John Carradine had already recorded his lines for The Great Owl, and they could not get him back. So they had to literally like snip little syllables and sounds around, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
This movie doesn't have like a big cast that's really worth talking about, I don't think. This is the first team up of Dom DeLuise and
Don Bluth.
And
the great duo.
The great duo, yes. He found his De Niro or his...
Man.
Dom DeLuise is always a canker sore in the ankle of any Don Bluth movie, I would say. I'm not a fan.
You don't like Tiger the cat.
Don't like Tiger the cat. I don't like Jeremy the Raven or whatever he is, the Crow. I just don't think I don't know. Dom DeLuise, he is funny. I did like Tiger the cat when I was a small child, and every small child, I suppose, does, because he's big and he's lovable and he's goofy and he's slapstick and he's silly. But a little bit like the lion, the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz, who I also thought was pretty cool. But the only other actor kind of note is Derek Jacobi, you may know.
Oh, yeah.
The great Derek Jacobi, the sort of royal British theater actor who, where do people he was Kenneth Branagh's mentor. So he shows up in a lot of Branagh's films. If you've ever, dear listener, seen Kenneth Branagh's quite well done, I think, version of Hamlet, Jacobi plays Claudius in that. And for my money, he's the best Claudius I've seen on film. Really great. Plays Claudius as kind of a more able statesman, like, okay, this guy actually makes a plausible king. He's not just a schemer that assassinated the old king, not just a villain. He's like, this guy's plausible. But I don't know, where else would people know Derek?
He's one of those guys who shows up in a lot of things.
Yeah.
But it's hard to tell you what. any number of Shakespeare thingamajigs.
Anytime you need someone to intone things ponderously, like he's a senator in Gladiator, and he gets some line about democracy has died in the sands of the Colosseum. Like he's the guy that you bring in to just give a little dignity to tripe like that.
So if you've ever seen the PBS show Cadfael, based on the detective series about the monk, Derek Jacobi is Cadfael. He's the monk. He's a lot of fun. He's really fun to watch.
Yes, he's also quite famous for playing Claudius in the miniseries I, Claudius, which is another thing from the same era.
Huh.
So, but he's been in The Crown. I'm just looking at lots of Branagh stuff.
It's likely you've seen him.
If you look him up and see his face, you'll be like, oh, I've seen that guy a million times.
Derek Jacobi.
So anyway, he plays Nicodemus, and I don't know that there's that much more. Like I said, Don Bluth really wanted there to be magic, just to sort of have that old school Disney, more spiritual feel and less sort of whatever you'd say about the book. And so they added a magical element to it. And I think that's all there is to say about the making of this film. The critics liked it okay. The audiences that got to see it tended to like it. It feels like if it had a real marketing machine and a studio that believes in it, it could have done pretty well. But it was only kind of a cult hit because it did not have those things. It is popular enough that it has, in 1998, it spawned a direct-to-video sequel called The Secret of Nimh 2, Timothy to the Rescue.
Is it Timmy to the Rescue?
Timmy to the Rescue, which was made without Bluth's input. And then there was also, I'm just glancing at Wikipedia to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. And there was a live-action sort of computer-animated remake that was reported in 2015, but nothing seems to have come of it. Yeah, I think it looks like the Russo brothers were announced to be executive producers on the remake. So we'll have their fine storytelling sense. So anyway, that is Don Bluth. I mean, I guess you can listen to our American Tale to hear the full story of what happened to Don Bluth after that. Basically, he hooked up with Spielberg, made two kind of minor classics in American Tale and Land Before Time, and then was just given carte blanche to make a bunch of really terrible, terrible things, as I've said several times now. As I think I said in that episode, the guy does not seem to have a good sense of what would actually be interesting for kids. Like for a guy that wants to truck an old school kind of Disney archetypal storytelling, his stories, even his classics, are so full of weird adult, like American Tales we talked about. It's about political grift and Tammany Hall and like all this stuff that's just so over the heads of its intended audience. And then it has, probably thanks to Spielberg, a really well-constructed central archetypal story of a child that's lost and wants to get back to his parents. But once Bluth divorces from Spielberg, he doesn't have that grounding. And so it's just like Thumbelina deals with sort of the politics of the frog prince wanting to have.
It's a very bizarre mixture of that kind of thing. Like, weird politics, matrimony, Thumbelina stuff, which is gross and boring, but also stuff straight from the id.
Right.
I didn't want you to animate that. I didn't want to see that. I didn't want that in my brain or my kid's brain, especially. Yeah,
it's kind of like he feels the need to have a giant spider menace Mrs. Brisby right before the owl crushes it.
Indigo.
Or when Fievel falls into a sewer grate and suddenly has like these insects. It's stuff like that or the waves turning into kind of a demon creature in American Tale. Those movies are more well anchored, but he's always got this. It's like he understands, he either just has a dark sensibility or he understands that these kinds of things, as they were done by Disney in the 40s, are supposed to have kind of real menace and real evil. And so he tries to include this element, and yet he doesn't actually have a sense of how to anchor it in the story, like in a way that makes sense. Like even something as simple as Jafar in Aladdin is like, okay, we understand this. He's an evil sorcerer. He's got some demonic sorcerer powers and he wants more power. Like you spend 2 seconds with that guy, you know who he is and what his deal is and why he would be working against Aladdin and why Aladdin needs to defeat him. And it's just simple. That sort of simplicity and storytelling, that sort of archetypal stuff constantly eludes Don Bluth.
Yes.
His villains are like, even in his good movies, it's like, well, it's a cat that's dressed up as a rat that's grifting the townsfolk. It's like, what?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's pretty funny.
I think I joked in our American Tail episode that if he had taken over Disney, which Disney reached out to him at a certain point and said, hey, you want to help us get our animation on track? And it's fun to sort of think of an alternate universe where he had, but he turned them down, and then the Disney Renaissance. But I think I joked in that episode that if he had done Beauty and the Beast, the Beauty and the Beast would have teamed up to reform French tax law or something like that. and then there'd be an evil monster that they'd have to fight.
Right.
Like that's about the level of his sensibilities. It's like,
Yeah.
It's like he learned that in order you want to appeal to both adults and kids. He has that in his head, but then he's like borderline autistic in the way that he implements it. Instead of finding things that are primal, that concern all of us, that both adults and kids would be interested in, he has like this part for kids, this part for adults, and he tries to mash them up. Anyway, he's a weird guy. His last movie was Titan AE in the year 2000.
Which I'm kind of interested in seeing now, for whatever silly reason.
I mean,
waste my time on it.
It would be interesting. That was an interesting movie because like it was right before CGI just sort of swept away any conception of 2D animation. And it comes out around the same time as like Treasure Planet, like a bunch of attempts by Disney and by others to do animation that teenagers and specifically teenage boys would be interested in. And the teenage boys just were not having it, no matter how sort of cool and how many laser guns and how many babes and stuff you put into these movies. Like a teenage boy is just not going to go out on a Friday night and spend $10 to buy a ticket to.
Well, the problem is it's still doing a Disney modeling kind of thing. And if teenage boys want to see that stuff, it's too late because anime has started to break in. And once you've seen anime, you go and look at these efforts, you're like, nah, you're way behind in action, in setting a mood. Like anime is way ahead of you.
You couldn't,
in the level of violence that we want to see, anime is going to be as grotesquely violent as you please.
You couldn't you're right. You couldn't calibrate it more poorly because if what you want is darkness and violence and action and stuff,
and sex for that matter,
you go to anime,
man,
which was hitting really big. Adult Swim had just around that same time in the year 2000 introduced Cowboy Bebop and stuff like that, and so that's where you go. And if what you want is something to see with your girlfriend that's cuddly and sweet, then you're going to go to the actual Disney movie or the actual Pixar movie,
or a rom-com,
or a
rom-com.
Matter. But if you're going to do animation, you're actually going to go all the way back into sort of sweet, kitty, romantic, fun, colorful animation because that's what your girlfriend is going to want to see. The one thing you're never going to do is split the difference and go to a PG-rated sort of movie meant to pander to you. It's just very wrong-headed thinking on terms of on an executive level, and you can find like I think I've seen them, like you go to the dollar store or a thrift store or something, and you see like crappy old Titan AE toy. Like they made whole lines of merchandise for these things. Like this is going to be the next Star Wars, and
very silly.
It was just very silly. So sorry, Don Bluth. Nice try, pal. I guess he did have one more hit. We mentioned it. Anastasia in 1997, very successfully aped the Broadway formula of the Disney Renaissance. We're gonna have some songs, and we're gonna have a princess, and we're gonna have an evil magician. It's just very, sort of unashamedly just stealing from Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin and that stuff. But it worked well enough, I guess, and people do have some fondness for it. Anyway, that's Don Bluth.
Ben, having established the context and talked about our baggage, we'd be remiss if we didn't give our point of view on the Secret of Nimh.
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
A new fantastic point of view.
Good as a point of view, anyway.
When was the last time you'd seen this movie before this watch?
Hoo boy. When I was just a little kid.
Okay, so this was your first time engaging with it as an adult person.
It was.
Age, weight, experience, and years. How'd you like it?
I could hardly watch it this time.
Really?
I was very sad.
Oh.
I just had a hard time. We had just read the book.
That did not help.
Oh, man, it sure didn't. And it's kind of the same trick with Don Bluth's American Tail, which as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, yeah, I understand why Kid Ben liked this so much. He knows how to make this stuff work for a kid on an emotional level.
Right.
He doesn't have to tell a coherent story. He doesn't have to make the plot make sense. He doesn't really have to make anything make sense. He can just throw fairy dust over everything through animation, just the power of his images, and give you the emotional beats in the... So there is an emotional logic to his movies.
Right.
I'm not trying to say this is just trash or something. I just mean it don't hold up as an adult. It's not a movie that you can watch as a kid and then love as an adult still or really enjoy as an adult. I don't think it is.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I had some patience for some of it. I think I was hoping that it would be better than it was. I find, as we already mentioned, Dom DeLuise to be pretty annoying. So
I had not remembered. I don't think I was annoyed as a kid nearly as much.
Right. I probably wasn't annoyed as a kid as all. I mean, just like I wasn't annoyed by Tiger the Cat. But boy,
that's right.
Jeremy did not do it for me this time.
No.
He was pretty obnoxious. And that was the thing that felt the most sort of anti-book. Just like, it's a fun, cuddly character. Don Bluth's good at action. It was, the animation was pretty. It has that nice hand-drawn quality that you like in an animation of this vintage. And you can tell money and time and skill went into it.
Yeah.
I think it might be my favorite of his films to look at. I mean, it'd be neck and neck with American Tail. But in some ways it feels, I'm sure American Tail was relatively less cheap in terms of its production. But I would say in some ways, American Tail feels more cheap just simply because it's so ambitious that it's occasionally biting off more than it can chew. Whereas I would say this usually feels like they're putting it all on the screen. They have something to prove, and there's a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff.
But yeah, the story leaves something to be desired, shall we say.
It really does. They really just a lot of random magic stuff happens.
Yeah, I mean, the places where he felt beholden to Disney were some of the worst places. Adding the magic element and then not, like, did I miss something or did he just not explain it at all?
There was zero explanation, and there's no reason in the movie for you to understand that there would be any magic or what the amulet is or where it came from. They just make it. I mean, I read that Bluth was like, hey, we need something to symbolize her inner strength.
We really don't. O'Brien didn't.
We really don't.
She's got plenty of inner strength there on the screen being shown in her actions. We really don't need an amulet.
Yeah.
And if we're going to have an amulet, we better establish that this world contains magic.
Because it's just such a weird blend of like, these rats were made super intelligent by science. Well, okay. Then what? I mean, that's all that you get of that storyline, actually.
Right.
The only other thing that you get is that the rats are kind of weird and that their leader uses magic.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, they don't feel any more intelligent than Mrs. Frisbee herself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could probably the thing to have done if they wanted to go this direction was to make the reason that the rats were different, that they were magical. Like just drop the entire escaping from the lab storyline. If you have to have magic, be like, well, they discovered an amulet and it made them all intelligent and able to build a city and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, O'Brien was already on the edge of being kind of too bizarre with all the elements that he was combining, but he pulled it off. But here they want to throw in more things without eliminating any of the things from O'Brien.
Right.
And yeah, it doesn't work. And then the other place where they're beholden to Disney and it totally flops is the ballad. That ballad
is amazingly bad.
Interminable and horrible and poorly written and just bad.
Yeah, I had not remembered the ballad.
Yeah, it took me by surprise. It took me by unpleasant surprise.
Yeah, I looked up the lyrics afterward. I was like, I have to know. Dream by night, wish by day. Love begins this way. Lovin' starts when open hearts touch and stay. So it's horrible.
I mean, that's before ChatGTV, but it feels like that's what was going on in someone's brain. Like, what are some generic, off-the-shelf ideas we can throw together? Some just cliches that don't even have interior logic.
It's amazing. Yeah, it really is. I don't know what else to say. I don't know. It in some ways, it felt this time like the opposite of the book. The book is all about these slow, deliberate pleasures of survival. And the movie is all about breakneck action and craziness. And it has, I mean, and another thing about the book is how unsentimental it is.
Yes.
And this movie is so sentimental. Now, some of that I understand. As a screenwriter, you're like, I'm going to make a kids movie. These kids are used to Disney. I've got to calibrate this material. I'm going to warm it up some.
Yeah, sure.
I'm fine with that. But he warmed it up a lot.
Yeah.
You've got anti-shrew. You just got stuff that feels over the top. It's hard to, I'm trying to remember back how I felt about this, because there was cross-pollination in my brain between the movie and the book, because I grew up enjoying both.
I imagine as a kid, there had to probably be a little disappointment that the book didn't contain a few things like the sword fight.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you too feel in the book like, I want a villain. I want a confrontation. But you don't get it. It's not that kind of book. You don't get it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I can understand them being like, well, we have this peripheral villainous characters from the book. Let's bring him in and give him something to do. But then you actually have to give him something to do and write a character for him, as opposed to what they did, which is just have him be antagonistic for a reason that's not particularly well explained. And
Yep, it's rough. They just gestured at a bunch of the most important plot and thematic elements of the book through a few lines of dialogue, and then there's a bad guy in a sword fight and a magic amulet. And there you go. And a ballad.
Cool sword fight.
It's a cool sword fight.
It is funny to see a children's film where they have a sword fight with like blood spurts and with the guy dying because the minion who he's mistreated throws a dagger into his back. It's like such a...
I know. I as a kid, I was like, it was like such a great climactic action scene. Just loved it. As a kid, all of these beats worked really well and they stuck with you. But as an adult, it's just like, this is arbitrary and it's not much fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, maybe our listeners' mileage will vary. Maybe we're bringing too much of the book and playing the comparison game, but...
I don't think so. I just wanted stuff to track. I mean, in the book, the reason that she didn't know about the rats of Nimh feels plausible.
Yeah.
The reason her husband never told her. But in the movie, nothing really makes any sense. You've got Nicodemus already watching over her, but then he's going to let her go to the Great Owl and not like send someone just to get her and help her.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense. And all the Great Owl's going to do is say, go to Nicodemus. And Nicodemus already knows that she's going to the Great Owl. The Great Owl's just going to say, go to Nicodemus. Nicodemus, why don't you just go tell someone that she can come visit you? Like, she doesn't need to do any of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel that we have the same mind at work here as the one that did American Tail, which works in spite of itself. But even there, as I've already said, you're like, really? Tammany Hall Grift? That's what you thought that kids were going to be interested in? And that goes together with this saga of this little boy. And you're doing the Jewish experience, but it's just like, this guy does not think in regular linear storytelling terms. He's got some sense of where the emotions should go. Although even that seems like it's not actually him being some kind of intuitive genius. It's more just him having seen Disney movies and knowing this is the part for the sad song and this is the part with this thing and now it's time for the comic relief and stuff like that. But it's just like, he is just not very good at actually building a story engine that takes you from point A to point Z in a way that makes sense and draws you in.
Yeah. The other thing, which we already talked about a little bit, you talked about the scene where the owl like crushes a spider that's about to eat Mrs. Frisbee. It is, he just...
Brisbee,
sorry,
please?
Mrs. Brisbee. He loves the grotesque details.
Yeah.
He loves just extra skulls, please. Extra cobwebs, extra warts. Like, if it's grotesque and a little uncomfortable, I like it, and I will put it in the animation. I will put it in the environment. And I don't think as a kid, I probably was like, oh, this is fun. This is creepy. But as an adult, I'm like, this isn't really adding to my, like, the Great Owl, instead of being, in the book, what would you wouldn't call him gross, whatever else you'd call him. But in the movie, it's like, he lives in a disgusting hole full of cobwebs and lots of animal skeletons and giant spiders. He's kind of a gross creature.
Yeah, it's a vulgar way of trying to get at what the book does, which is have him be this kind of transcendent or other, this creature that's beyond everyone. You know, he's kind of a Jedi. He's just got that.
That's right.
That wisdom, but he's also got this sort of existential despair that goes beyond, like he can see his own end in a way that most of these creatures have to be concerned with the immediate details of their lives. But the Great Owl gets to sit there and think, and there's actually quite a beautiful little scene of existential despair with the Great Owl. It's got some poetry to it, as I think we talk about on our Sanity episode. But yeah, to reduce that to he's in a creepy environment with skulls.
It just seems too bad.
Yeah. I mean, again, you kind of have to wonder, like, what is it that Don Bluth actually wants to do? What would make him happy? If he was just making the movie the way that he wanted to make, I wonder what it would be. I'm not sure that we really even know the answer, because he's always caught in between the commercial interests of making these kinds of movies and what seems to, I mean, obviously he's drawn to the dark and the grotesque in some ways.
Yeah.
But not in a way that he ever feels like he can just go for it and give you like a Henry Selick doing Nightmare Before Christmas kind of thing. In other words, there are people that have made a good living just doing that. You don't have to love them. You don't have to hate them. But there are people that just do that. But he's not one of them. And maybe there just wasn't a market for it at the time.
Yeah. And Henry Selick's brand of grotesque is actually much more straightforward.
Yes, it is. Like you know where you're at and what
you know where you're at. He's like, we're in a grotesque world. You're going to see grotesque things, but it's all going to be kind of cheeky, kind of witty, or at least attempting to be. It's not really going to. I mean, actually, I don't know that Henry Selick does do some stuff from the id, but he does
more stuff from the Halloween spirit store or something. Like,
that's right.
Ooh, it's a spooky clown. It's like that kind of stuff.
That's right.
I think the closest he comes to the id is in that guy that's made out of bugs. You remember that guy?
Yeah.
The Oogie Boogie Man.
Bad guy. Yeah.
That's pretty grotesque in its way. But
Coraline is pretty good, but that's Neil Gaiman's id.
Yeah, Coraline. But it feels like a self-consistent world. Like when you buy a ticket for Coraline, you know about what you're going to get. Say, obviously the same thing for Nightmare Before Christmas. I mean, Nightmare Before Christmas has become its own brand because people want to feel that way and want to dress that way and want to think that way, you know. And so but you pay for Secret of Nimh. It's like, is the person that likes that soppy ballad the same person that's going to like the giant tarantula being squashed into green goo? And is that the same person that's going to like a sword fight? And is that the same person that's going to like a magical amulet? It's just like,
it's weird.
It's all this different stuff. It's really interesting. I think it might actually be instructive for some of our listeners, if they're interested in storytelling, to just watch this and compare it to their favorite Disney movie or their favorite children's film and think about why it doesn't work. Because it's like any given scene you could say is just fine. I mean, the song's bad.
Yeah.
And there are things we've been pointing out, like the spider that just feels wildly out of place. But you could imagine a movie where a mouse has to go through a creepy tree trunk full of skulls and bugs, where it would be a great scene.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
The individual beats are mostly fine. It's well animated. It's well voiced, with the exception of Dom DeLuise, I would say.
Yeah,
for the most part. I mean, it's just not well conceived on a big picture level. It's like he didn't actually. I hate it when people criticize things for not following the source material to the letter. You know, when somebody's mad that Lord of the Rings doesn't go to Tom Bombadil or have the Scouring of the Shire. It's like, that is not the right reason to be mad at Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Of course they couldn't spend the time to go to Tom Bombadil. Yeah, sure, it'd be nice if this was a HBO series where we could just adapt it chapter by chapter, but that's not what they were doing. And when you buy your ticket, it's unfair to expect them to do that. But it is fair to expect them to have read and absorbed the book and to feel like you find them liking and wanting to evoke the spirit of the book. And if you want to love Lord of the Rings, you can say it does that. If you want to criticize it, you can argue that it doesn't. But what you don't find here is that it does not feel like he actually found something that really spoke to him in the Richard O'Brien book. It feels more like he just thought, oh, this is a good template for me to do a kind of Disney pastiche or something like this.
Yeah, but I don't think he knew that.
Yeah.
I don't think, it's not like I feel like he has any commentary on Robert C. O'Brien. It was more like, this is just the way that he thinks about adapting something. And if he adapts it so far that it becomes almost anti what he had adapted.
Mm-hmm.
He's not really aware of what he's done.
Yeah, he doesn't realize it. Yeah, exactly. He's just like, but if you can't point to something like, I loved that book, and so this is why I made the movie, because I wanted to capture, like, I knew I couldn't do everything. I knew we were going to have to change this. I knew we had to introduce magic, but I just loved the resourcefulness and thoughtfulness and courage of Mrs. Frisbee / Brisbee. Like, like if you could see that thing, and there's not that one thing where he just loved it. It's also true that he gives short shrift to all the stuff that I loved the most in the book. Like they reduced the flashback of the rats escaping.
I know.
To
nothing.
Less than a minute maybe.
But you're gonna have like no less than 3 needles going into 3 rats, which is incredibly grotesque. And I think that makes me uncomfortable for a kid's film.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a pretty pointed thing to do.
Right. Just trying to inject a little
science
into this movie. Yeah, man. I wish we had more good things to say about this movie because
such fond memories of it as a kid.
Yeah, I was looking forward to revisiting it, and I was thinking it might be fun to introduce our audience to it. And I hate it when it happens that like Gunga Din was kind of this way. I'm sure there've been others where it's like, yeah, we're gonna go back to this thing that's really great, and then it's like our audience probably wouldn't have even watched that if it wasn't for us, and now they've wasted their time. So sorry, audience. Maybe you liked it better than we did.
Hey, yeah.
What are positive things we can say about Secret of Nimh?
We said the animation's really pretty.
Animation's pretty.
The score, actually, apart from the ballad, is quite good.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with
Jerry Goldsmith.
JG, yeah, Jerry Goldsmith.
Yeah, I like the voice work pretty well. It's fine.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm like over the moon about it.
No, I mean, it's hard to judge because you don't love any of the characters or...
No, I mean, sorry to go back to a criticism, but I'm a big fan of the Mrs. Frisbee from the books.
Yes.
And her quiet, not sentimental. But this Mrs. Frisbee is a lot more of a scaredy mouse and much more just sentimental, like, oh, I love you, Jeremy. Oh, I just like, and I have some sympathy for that because you're making a kid's movie and you want the character to have some warmth.
Mm-hmm.
I get it, but she's pushed pretty far from what her characterization in the book.
Hey, look, if you want to discard the book, that's fine. You better have something really entertaining and good to put in its place.
Yeah.
If you just want the title and the concept and then you've got your own story to tell, I could roll with that. The book still exists, but yeah.
Give me something.
I mean, Jenner has a cool sounding voice, but it's like the characters and nothing. So I guess he thinks they should steal from the like, I don't know. Do they even say why Jenner's the bad guy besides that he sounds and looks like a bad guy? And
No, I don't remember that they do.
And Nicodemus is like this super decrepit old sage kind of character who's designed to evoke the owl. Like they're two sides of the same coin, kind of. I mean, it's
really weird.
It's just, I'm sure that all made sense in Don Bluth's brain, or I hope it made sense in someone's brain, but sorry, Secret of Nimh.
Yep.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else positive I could say. I mean, Don Bluth's good at action. I like the frantic nature of like the cat trying to attack them. I mean, it's not as good as similar material in the book, but it's I like how it's the same thing that I like about the cat attack at the beginning of the Fievel movie. I just like how ferocious he makes that stuff, or sharp tooth in For Time. Sword fight's good. Gosh, there's got to be at least one other positive thing we can say here. It's short.
It is short. Yeah, it's short.
Well under the 90-minute mark.
I'm not sure what else to say.
Man, well, how many scientifically exploited rats out of 40 would you give to this movie?
Oh, I'm not sure how to feel about that. Maybe I give it 15.
Yeah, I was going to give it 10.
I was thinking of 10, and then I was like, maybe I'm just in a bad mood. I'm not in a bad mood, though.
No, it's, yeah.
Maybe I should just give it 10. I should just give it 10 and say that if I were a kid, I would give it like 35. My kid self gave it 35 out of 40 rats.
Yeah, I could see a kid really enjoying this. I could also see this movie just like going under and or over a modern kid's head. The animation won't be what they're used to necessarily.
No.
Grown up on any kind of Pixar or anything. They might just be like, huh? This is slightly more sober and less jokey and self-aware than we're used to, but it's also not actually evoking like a real fairy tale kind of...
Right. Yeah, I don't know what this would do for a modern kid raised on Pixar. That's a different kettle of fish. I was raised on Disney.
Yeah.
Star Wars, whatever.
Yeah. I was raised on bologna sandwiches and 2% milk.
Bunch of baloney.
It was a bunch of bologna.
Kind of like Secret of Nimh.
It's kind of like Secret of Nimh.
Well, sorry, Secret of Nimh.
Sorry, Secret of Nimh. I say if you're interested in some Nimhology, then just go read the book.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
And if someone who actually had some talent wanted to write some more books, I'd be all for it. I think this is a cool universe that I do actually wish there was more.
Yeah, me too.
Like if they wanted to make a modern, like if Netflix decides they're going to fund a new series or something like that, I would be intrigued. I would love for somebody to. I know there have been various things batted around over the years in terms of.
Yeah, what did we talk about when we did the book? Is there any?
Well, there are the two sequel books that his daughter wrote.
Yeah. But there's no show adaptation. I guess there's Watership Down.
There isn't one. I think they have talked about it. I think maybe even they've announced it before, but nothing's ever actually come out.
Huh.
So,
All right.
Sorry, Secret of Nimh. You have a combined or an average 13 scientifically modified rats out of 40.
All right.
Ben, if people want to release the scientifically modified rat of money into the maze of this podcast, how do they do that?
Very easily, Nathan. They go to patreon.com/sanity at the movies, and they can release that scientifically modified rat into the maze.
Give us some cash injections.
That's right.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, I'm sure you're glad you listened all the way through for that. Until next time, he's never prepared, folks.
Dream by night, wish by day. Love begins this way.
Love begins this way.